Okay. Well, we're sort of at a crux in the course, corresponding to a crux in Sellars' intellectual development. And so I thought I would start by taking stock a little bit, because we're transitioning between two completely different topics. That we've been talking about modality, we're going to talk about nominalism and abstract objects now. I always had a big problem understanding what the connection between these was in Sellars' mind, and I think I do understand what he thought the connection was, and understanding that makes a nice transition to the last thing we're going to talk about, the last completely different topic you would think, namely his philosophical naturalism, the view that's epitomized in this Kantian-Menzura passage. So I thought first I would talk a little bit about what I've called pragmatic metalinguistic expressivism about some vocabulary or other. I mean, you might have noticed that when I'm speaking in propria persona, I talk about vocabularies and metavocabularies instead of languages and metalanguages. That's not Sellars' terminology. I picked up the use of the term vocabulary, the vocabulary from my teacher Rorty, who introduced it in the wake of Quine's two dogmas, where he'd argued that you can't distinguish between change of meaning, that is change of the language that you're speaking, and change of belief, that is the change in the theory that you endorse, which he found, I think, properly chiming with Wittgenstein's observation in the investigations that understanding each other requires not just agreement in meanings, but, he says, strange as it seems, also agreement in judgments that form the background for that. So if we shouldn't talk about languages because theory is a contrast term with that, what can we do? Well, the suggestion was talk about vocabularies. And then the vocabularies can be more or less comprehensive, so I'm happy enough to talk not just about the vocabulary of physics, but about nautical or culinary vocabulary, but also to talk about autonomous vocabularies you could speak, you could deploy, though you could deploy no others. And those are obviously quite different from the sort of restricted nautical or culinary vocabularies. But in particular, I've been making much of the distinction between semantic metavocabularies and pragmatic metavocabularies. And we saw from Sellars' earliest writings, he was identifying philosophy with the pure pragmatics of empirical languages in general. That was the way he wanted to talk. And I suggested that starting with thinking about his looks talk point, but continuing into his discussion of modality, that really what he was doing was giving an analysis of what we were doing in using looks talk and making first-hand use of it, to use one of his phrases, where he has, I think, a compelling account that what you're doing is withholding a commitment. And that's the sort of thing that you would say in a pragmatic metavocabulary. And similarly, I think he has a, if not yet compelling, at least colorable account of what you're doing in making first-hand use of modal vocabulary and talking about what's a law or what's necessary. Namely, what you're doing is endorsing or committing yourself to the goodness of a pattern of material inferences. Now, Sellars thought of what he was doing as transposing these issues into a metalinguistic key. That was the insight of Carnap's that was the basis of his conversion to what he called the new way of words. But he also saw that the notion of metalanguage or metavocabulary that he was using, the notion of what's metalinguistic, couldn't be Tarski and Carnap's notion of a syntactic or even really a semantic metalanguage or metavocabulary. And we'll rehearse in a minute, again, some of the reasons that's true, and sort of didn't know what to say. Talked about what was conveyed rather than what was stated. Talked about a claim having the same force as, rather than the same content as another. But he had very little to say about that notion of conveying or of having the same force as. I mean, I think one of the big, outstanding intellectual puzzles about the first 10 years of his active life is why he didn't use the notion of a pragmatic metavocabulary that he had early on and see, well, that's what I'm saying. I'm explaining the use of modal vocabulary in a pragmatic metalanguage instead of in a semantic one. I think that would have given him somewhere to go in trying to explicate the notion of metalinguistic that he was using, that, as far as I can see, he found just to be a wall that all he could do was bump his head up against. And I really don't understand why he didn't. But I didn't understand this well enough to ask him when he was around to answer it. Okay, another important distinction apropos of expressivism that has sort of been floating around but I haven't talked about explicitly is the difference between global and local expressivism. And that's whether you're an expressivist about everything or only about some vocabularies. If it's only some vocabularies, then you're a local expressivist about it. Sellars denies global descriptivism, we've seen, which subsequent discussions talk not about descriptivism, but about representationalism. And I think, though there are important differences between the concept of description and that of representation, at the level of abstraction that these discussions normally take place, it's the same thought. And the question is whether one's going to use a representational semantic paradigm in order to understand the content of all expressions. That would be a global representationalism. Whether you're going to assimilate, well, what you're doing when you use all expressions to describing, the descriptivism, I think, moves us closer to a pragmatic rather than a semantic formulation of it. But there have been people who not only denied global descriptivism or representationalism, like Sellars, but were global anti-descriptivists or global anti-representationalists, global expressivists. Arguably Wittgenstein is that he at least resists representationalist or descriptivist analyses of some kinds of expression, first person avowals, pain statements, and so on. But he also says things that suggest that that pattern really doesn't apply even to ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. My teacher Rorty drew globally anti-representationalist conclusions from the difficulties he saw representationalism as having gotten modern philosophy into. In our own day, Hugh Price, who is the Bertrand Russell professor at Trinity College, Wittgenstein's and Russell's old college, is a global expressivist. If you're interested in tracking that down, he has a book on it, Expressivism, Pragmatism, and Representation, that has essays by him and by some other people about this. But one can also be a local expressivist and say, well, the descriptivist or the representationalist paradigm, depending on whether we're thinking from a pragmatic or a semantic perspective, that's right for some vocabulary. That picture that Wittgenstein had in the Tractatus of picturing, that is the way some vocabulary works. What I've been calling ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary is a good category for that. The term expressivism here, which I think it's really Hugh Price who has settled that terminology, is borrowed from metaethical expressivism. Ayer and Stevenson in the first wave of metaethical expressivism, Gibbard, maybe the paradigm in second wave metaethical expressivism. That's a kind of local expressivism. It's about moral vocabulary or more broadly normative vocabulary, but they don't have anything to say typically about, say, abstract object talk or lethic modal talk. Simon Blackburn reads Hume as an expressivist about modal vocabulary and about normative vocabulary, and follows him in that. Blackburn's, what he calls quasi-realism, is an expressivism about those two kinds of vocabulary, that he says you need to distinguish the function of those from description or representation of states of affairs, and give broadly expressivist accounts of them, though different ones for the normative and the modal. Yeah.
Are we treating representationalism and expressivism as exclusive and exhaustive as the possibilities here?
Well, of course, that's that's a very good question, and I wish people had sort of asked that in the tradition. All the people I've talked about so far treat them as exclusive, and if you ask them, well, is there an alternative? Is there a third possibility? Are these exhaustive? They might well admit, oh yeah, maybe poetic vocabulary where you're worried about the sounds. Insofar as you're worried about the sounds, you say, well, that's not. Maybe that works some other way. But the sort of serious, hardworking vocabulary, I think they're thinking of it as not only exclusive but exhaustive. Now, these local anti-descriptivists and anti-representationalists, the treatment of this, I think, well, if Blackburn's right, we can go back to Hume, but in this immediate tradition is the Wittgenstein and the Tractatus, who solved a whole host of problems that he and Russell had as logical atomists in the early years and the teens of the 20th century, worrying about the nature of negative facts and of conditional facts. How were conjunctive facts different from the two facts they were the conjunction of? Disjunctive facts were puzzling as well, saying, look, you're causing yourself all sorts of unnecessary, distinctively metaphysical puzzles because you're assuming that these bits of logical vocabulary have the function of picturing, describing, or representing some feature of the world. They don't. They're features of the way representations get put together. Now, interestingly, Sellars does not, any more than Carnap did, offer a metalinguistic account of logical vocabulary. They had this metalinguistic strategy for particularly modal vocabulary, but also for talk of universals, of abstract object things. They still thought of logic as in a box by itself. Whereas it seems to me, once you've seen how the expressivist analyses go, that one ought to take broadly the same attitude towards logical vocabulary. That is, as I think of it, paradigmatic logical vocabulary like the conditional lets you say that an inference is good, put into the form of an assertable declarative sentence, a conditional, the claim, in effect, that an inference is good. And a negation, I think of as in the same way, codifying material incompatibilities. So Sellars' particular twist on local expressivisms, he's not going to be an expressivist about ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. He's not going to be an expressivist about theoretical vocabulary, which you can see classical instrumentalism as a kind of expressivism. Anyway, it's an anti-representationalism about theoretical vocabulary, but he's a scientific realist about theoretical vocabulary. That has a descriptive representational role too, but not modal vocabulary, not talk about universals, not semantic vocabulary, talk about meanings or propositions. And though he didn't pursue this, not normative vocabulary either, he's going to be more like the metaethical expressivists in his treatment of normative vocabulary. He sees it as expressing we intentions. And this part of Sellars' work has not been much studied. There was a recent book on it. It is arousing considerable interest now, but it hasn't been worked over well enough for us to understand it very well. Certainly I don't. At any rate, he's a local expressivist about this. But all these people took it that these were mutually exclusive. That you either saw a representational function or you saw an expressive function. And this caused trouble because I've suggested the difference between what I called first wave metaethical expressivists and second wave ones, like Blackburn and Gibbard, is that the second wave appreciated Geach's challenge, the challenge to explain embedded uses of this vocabulary. When I say, if that's a moral obligation, then it's what you ought to do, I haven't endorsed the claim that I haven't endorsed any course of action because it's embedded as the antecedent of a conditional. The natural thing would be to say, well, there is a descriptive representational content to this. That's what's being used as the embedded component to build up a more complex content, which you can then invest with pragmatic force, you can endorse. But as long as you think that a descriptive representational role is incompatible with playing an expressive role, that isn't open to you. And I've suggested as a critical but sort of friendly amendment to Sellars, that we needn't think that, and that we needn't give up what was right about these expressivist analyses, because we can think of there being more complex relations between what's expressed in a pragmatic metavocabulary that lets you say what you're doing when you say something in the object vocabulary, on the one hand, and a semantic metavocabulary that lets you say something about what you're saying, about the content, rather than the act, when you use the object vocabulary. And that we could mark the difference between these expressions and ground level ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary in two ways. That, first of all, the OED vocabulary doesn't have some other vocabulary that it's about in the way that modal vocabulary and normative vocabulary on these accounts are letting you say something about what you're doing in using some other vocabulary, ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. So there's nothing that stands to OED vocabulary the way OED vocabulary stands to modal vocabulary, for instance, on Sellars' account. And then second, the descriptive content that one's going to assign to these expressions is parasitic on the expressive role. The claim is going to be you can't understand what you're saying in making first-hand use of modal vocabulary without understanding what you're doing when you use that vocabulary. Now, exactly how you get from the one to the other, this I think is an open question. I don't think we're without clues about it, but it certainly is not all sorted out. I think we can see these expressions as playing a dual role. As in the first instance, having to be understood in terms of what you're doing in using them, specified in a pragmatic metavocabulary, but then also playing a role, having a semantic content, something specifiable in a semantic metavocabulary that we're somehow going to understand in terms of what you're saying in the pragmatic metavocabulary. So sort of all of these issues are going to come up again as we look at another example, as we look at him applying this apparatus in particular to talk about universals, abstract objects. And though he tends to run these together, semantic notions like proposition or meaning as well. I'm going to say less about that. Let me just mention in passing that if we think about terms like alethic modal vocabulary and deontic normative vocabulary, talk about commitment and entitlement or authority and responsibility, we might well ask, when you classify some bit of vocabulary as being alethic modal or deontic normative, are you saying something that's best understood in a pragmatic metavocabulary or something that's best understood in a semantic metavocabulary? Are you talking about the use of these expressions, or are you talking about the content? And it seems to me one wants to say, well, you're saying something that requires you to make claims in both of those. At least this dual aspect theory is going to require that. So that terms like modal and normative themselves are amphibious between the semantic and the pragmatic metavocabularies. Now, there is an alternative because although I've just suggested that you can't understand either what you're doing in using modal or normative vocabulary or what you're saying with it. Sorry, you can't understand either what you're doing when you use the word modal vocabulary or the term normative vocabulary, except in terms of commitments that would have to be expressed both in a pragmatic metavocabulary and in a semantic metavocabulary. These terms ramify. That is, you can consider a semantic metavocabulary for a pragmatic metavocabulary. How are we going to understand the content of claims about what you're doing when you use an empirical descriptive expression? So for instance, if I want to claim, as I do want to claim, that the pragmatic metavocabulary has to itself be a normative vocabulary, has to specify not just dispositions to use, but proprieties of use, has to enforce a distinction between correct and incorrect uses. That's going to be a claim in a semantic meta vocabulary for a pragmatic metavocabulary. And the argument that I would use for the claim that the vocabulary used for the semantic claim that the vocabulary used in a pragmatic metavocabulary must include normative vocabulary, that would be a pragmatic argument, as that would be an argument about what you're doing when you use the pragmatic metavocabulary. In the same way, I would say, when I want to argue about the relative expressive powers of two different semantic metavocabularies, the semantic metavocabulary of Tarskian model theory on the one hand, and the the expressive power of proof theory of the sort Kenson introduced on the other, each of them I think of as playing, as having the expressive task of specifying inferential roles, but you can either do it in a model theoretic way or you can do it in a proof theoretic way, and there are trade-offs between them. There's some things that one does better and some things that the others do better. That's a discussion that's conducted in a semantic metavocabulary, a semantic metavocabulary for a semantic metavocabulary. And the arguments are going to turn on features of what you're doing when you do, when you make claims in model theoretic and particularly in proof theoretic terms. So I think there's a study that is sort of wide open at this point about relations between semantic and pragmatic metavocabularies. They can stand in quite complex relations to one another, and really important philosophical issues take place when you think about them through this lens in those relations between these different kinds of vocabularies. So this is one of the sort of lessons for work going forward that I would draw from Sellars' application of these ideas.
Would you call this a kind of ascent, or is it more horizontal?
No, I think of it as ascent.
Okay.
I mean, the dimension of verticality is the aboutness. You're talking about either the content, what is said, or the act, the saying of it. Remember the notorious ing ed ambiguity here. So that's the dimension along which it's vertical. And as I say, it ramifies. You can go levels up here, but I also suggested that there can be pragmatically mediated semantic relations between vocabularies, where in order to understand the relation between two vocabularies, one needs to look at the vocabulary in which you say what it is you're doing when you use the other vocabulary. And that's not necessarily a vertical thing, it's a more complicated expression. This is the topic of my Locke lectures, and the first one of them sets out in a fairly basic way an apparatus for thinking about these things. But as I say, I consider this baby steps in a big area. Okay, that's sort of saying where we are here. Sellars had this unbelievably productive 5 years after EPM, going up through 62 or 63. I mean, he was on fire during this time. So 56, we have EPM. The next year, we get the long counterfactuals, dispositions, and the causal modalities that we've been talking about. In 58, he gives the 2 lectures at Yale, where he was moving from the University of Minnesota, the 2 that are the Grammar and Existence paper, and a year after that writes Naming and Saying, following up on that, and the following year writes the long Abstract Entities that really pulls this view all together. And as I think I said last time, these 3 essays, well, Grammar and Existence and Abstract Entities are sort of double essays. It's about 5 essays worth a book. This is the most worked out material that Sellars ever produced. He never figured anything out at the level of fineness of detail that he did here. And there's every reason to believe that he understood that and was perfectly happy with the account he'd given here, that he didn't find any reason to change it later on. And that isn't true, certainly, of the treatment of modality, which he just sort of hit a dead end and didn't know where to go with it, so never wrote about again. And it's not true with the epistemological arguments and the philosophy of mind in EPM. He continually went back, trying to refine that, unhappy with this formulation and this other formulation, really right till the end of his life. But this stuff he figured out. Now, why did he care about it at all? For most of the time that I've been thinking about Sellars, I could not see any reason why the philosopher who had so much to say about what were evidently, to me, important topics in EPM, in CD-CM, would put absolutely on the axis of his thought this extended treatment of the problem of universals, how to justify being a nominalist and not believing in abstract objects. This was something, well, okay, the medievals cared about it, and I could see it as a topic that philosophers could be interested in, but I couldn't see it as central to, understanding us, understanding our epistemic relation to the world, understanding talking in general. This just seemed like an extremely narrow, specialized topic. Why was this so important to him? Now, the fact that this was another test bench for this metalinguistic expressivism is sort of one important clue. Here's another place for him to try out these tools. Nonetheless, why did he care so much about this topic? And I at least think I have, some inkling now that I didn't have before. But it concerns the path from this work to his view about scientific naturalism and the sense in which, in the dimension of description and explanation, science is the measure of all things. There's a fairly direct connection between them, though not an obvious one, I think. So let me say something first about what the topic is. So Sellars is happy enough to say, well, what he means to be giving a once and for all solution to is the traditional philosophical problem of universals. Now, anyone else who said that, I would accuse of childlike innocence in believing that there was such a thing as the traditional problem of universals. But Sellars sees how it ramifies into a whole lot of different worries about universals that were pursued in considerable detail in the Middle Ages. And that's what divided nominalists like Occam from realists like Scotus. He has an elaborated, fine-grained view about how all these issues interdigitate and how they're related to one another. What he is childlike and innocent about is the idea that we'll understand what he's talking about when he says the traditional philosophical problem of universals. I think a good way in is to think about abstract objects. Well, that's sort of a ladder that I'm going to urge we kick away after we climb up on it. There's different ways of not believing in abstract objects, but I don't think there are any abstract objects, even to be a nominalist about. That is, when they say, I'm a nominalist, I don't believe in abstract objects, I don't think what they're saying actually in the end makes sense. But let me say something about abstraction, which is one of those words that has the ing-ed ambiguity. And in this case, I think the way into understanding it is through the activity, through abstracting. Now, that's not the way the topic is normally approached. Normally, it's approached by saying, well, there are these concrete objects, the ones that we causally interact with, and then there are abstract objects that we can't causally interact with. Numbers, for instance, sets, pure sets. But if we ask, well, what is this abstraction talk? What do those abstract objects have in common? Well, it's that our access to them is by a process of abstraction. What we're clearest on is the relation between, I'll say, more concrete and more abstract objects, an asterisk here. Frege is the one who got really clear about this in his Grundlagen. one of the founding sort of documents of analytic philosophy. He says, the way you introduce a more abstract object on the basis of more concrete objects is to specify an equivalence relation on the abstract objects. So an equivalence relation, by definition, is one that's reflexive. Everything bears it to itself, A-R-A. It's symmetric. If A-R-B, then B-R-A. And it's transitive. If A-R-B and B-R-C, then A-R-C. Now, that's true of identity. You know, identity is an equivalence relation. But lots of other things are too. So Frege says, paradigmatic example. Suppose you're doing Euclidean geometry, and you've got a bunch of lines all on a plane. You can pick out the equivalence relation of being parallel to. Every line is parallel to itself, sort of a trivial case. If A is parallel to B, B is parallel to A. And it's transitive. If A is parallel to B and B is parallel to C, then A is parallel to C. Now, parallel lines are different, but they do stand in this equivalence relation. But now we can introduce new objects, call them directions of lines, and say that if A is parallel to B, then the direction of A is the same as, identical to, the direction of B. We introduce a new concept, direction of a line, where the identity of directions, that's an equivalence relation, is just defined by the equivalence relation on the more concrete objects. So we can introduce things like the direction of the Earth's axis. As an abstract object, it'll be the same direction as all the lines now in 3 space that are parallel to it. But that's a new object. Once people were doing set theory, they thought, oh, well, one new object in the vicinity is the equivalence class of all the lines that are parallel to A. Think of that class of things. Those will be all and only the lines that share their direction with A. And one thing you might think is that the direction of the line just is that equivalence class of parallel lines. But you also might think, no, there's a more complicated relation between this abstract object that you've introduced, directions, and that equivalence class. Now, in mathematics, forming more abstract objects by introducing equivalence classes and then talking about the things you've introduced on that basis, and then defining equivalence relations on them and introducing still more abstract objects, climbing to the sky on this. Any mathematician does this 6 times before breakfast. This is one of the sort of most basic operations. There's sort of more complicated analogs of it that you can do, but this really is bread and butter. But Frege was the one who really got clear about what you were doing when you did that. Who said, you start off with some objects that, relative to this process, count as concrete. I mean, maybe we got them by abstraction from something else, but relative to this move, these are concrete objects. And then to do an abstraction on them, all you have to do is define an equivalence relation on them. And that may be, well, I mean, that's at the level of those concrete objects. But then the act of abstracting is treating that equivalence relation as though it were identity. And what it's an identity of is a new kind of thing, because it has new criteria of identity and individuation. But you have complete control over that if, at the concrete level, you know which things stand in the equivalence relation. Now, of course, philosophers do this abstraction all the time, too. Maybe we're introducing abstract objects as moral values. Well, we have to say when two acts have the same moral value. What is the equivalence relation that we're going to use to define this new kind of thing, a moral value? And this Fregean account of abstraction lets us be very clear about what we're doing and what the criteria of adequacy of doing it properly are. Now, Frege says what he's on about in the Grundlagen is introducing numbers, natural numbers, as abstract objects. Here, the concrete things are collections of objects. There are there? I was going to say there are 3 virtues, 9 graces. I don't pretend that there's 3 Greek virtues. There's 3 stooges. The equivalence relation is being put in a one-to-one correspondence. So every collection is in a one-to-one correspondence with itself, and if there's a one-to-one correspondence of stooges with virtues, then there's a one-to-one correspondence of virtues with stooges, and it's transitive. If you can put set A in one-to-one correspondence with B, and B in one-to-one correspondence with C, then you can set A in one-to-one correspondence with C. And now we say, okay, then we say the number of this collection is 3, in the way that we say the number, or is the same as the number of this collection, in the same way that we say the direction of this line is the same as the direction of this line, if they stand in the equivalence relation of parallel. So numbers are abstract objects, but here's how you introduce number terms into your language. In effect, he says, what I shall mean by object is what's referred to by anything, any expression that is used as a singular term. Here I've introduced these singular terms, so numbers are objects. They're abstract objects, you can't causally interact with them, but there's nothing mysterious about them because I've told you how to talk about them in terms of things you already know how to talk about. Sort of whatever those are, whatever countables that you've got. So, maybe I'm rehearsing these things that are sort of well known to you, but this is a sort of paradigm of a philosophical understanding of something that, we can wave our hands about abstraction and so on, or you can really sort of understand how it works. And Frege explained that to us. Well, and nominalists, like Frege's student Carnap, and like his students, Goodman and Quine, and Sellars, are nominalists about abstract objects. They say, no, what's in the world is the concrete things, not the abstractions. And Sellars' proposal is to give a meta-linguistic account of abstract object talk, of terms that are introduced by the method of abstraction. to say, think about the language that you use to describe the concrete objects and their relations. Well, abstract object talk I'm going to interpret as metalinguistic, as talk about that kind of talk. That's the strategy. And if you ask me about the universal triangularity, the sort of thing that the medievals worried about, what do we say about the reality of triangularity in relation to the reality of this triangle? There are things of different kinds. Can we univocally say there are both things? There are both things of both kinds. He's going to say, well, triangularity, don't you see, is looking at the equivalence class of triangles. It falls under the common noun shape. We can introduce shapes where the equivalence relation is geometrical congruence, kind of mapping that preserves everything but size about geometrical objects to get a sense of shape in which sort of particular triangular shapes, this scalene one with just these angles, has many particular triangles have that same shape. Or we can say just the notion of triangularity, where the equivalence relation is just having the same number of sides and vertices, namely 3 in it. But all of these empiricists wanted to say these expressions work very differently from ordinary empirical descriptive ones. It's the ordinary empirical descriptive ones that describe what's in the world, that represent the way the world is, and abstract objects are not in that world anyway, in the same sense in which the concreta from which they were abstracted are. And Sellars is going to give a metalinguistic account of those things. So I haven't said anything about why you might want to do that yet, but that's that's the nominalist, the metalinguistic nominalist program. Yeah.
You might have said something about this, and I might have missed it. But what's the status of these equivalent relations on this kind of picture? Like, are they?
Well, you're right. You're right that this there's going to be an issue about this snake biting its own tail when we ask about relations, which are kind of universal. But Frege isn't worried about that. So Frege's thought is, assume that everything is hunky-dory at the ground level. So you can, in the language of geometry, you can talk about lines and relations of being parallel or intersecting of them. And we're not going to treat one as more problematic than the other. What we want to do is understand these more abstract sort of directions and the relations between them, being identical or being different, is about all directions can do, but still we can talk about those. Now, Sellars, by the end of the day, is going to want to say, yeah, and those relations aren't real either. And there's a real question about how intelligible that is to drive the view down that far. But to jump ahead a little bit, you might ask, why is nominalism called nominalism? Nomen is name. Okay, we don't believe that names like three are proper names, there aren't objects for them. Or triangularity, I mean, that's a noun. But still, what is the relation of names to nominalism? And the relation is, nominalists think only what can be named exists. It's what's referred to by singular terms, not predicates or verbs, not logical connectives, and so on. Sellars would use this phrase, what's in the world in the narrow sense, what's real in the narrow sense, it's only objects, particulars, things that can be named. And the trouble is, from his point of view, from the point of view of all of this tradition, that you can nominalize any part of speech. So we have the predicate triangular, but we have a way of nominalizing that, turning the predicate into a singular term, into a name. And you can do that with verbs, as well as adjectives. You can do it with relation words. We have linguistic forms for doing this. Kite and height auf Deutsch. I can talk about my cute cat and its cuteness. Ness is performing that expression for us. And it's worth, and so let me say, at the end of the day, I think the key thing to understand about this line of thought is the relation between nominalization and nominalism. To understand what you're doing when you introduce a singular term by nominalizing some other part of speech. Now, this is not the way these issues are normally thought about, but that's, in the end, I'll claim, what the key is. And let me mention, it's, we have other things that are, other mechanisms in the language that are parallel to this. So, I mean, unless you've sort of studied classical languages, you probably, I'm conjecturing, don't actually know what a participle is. Anybody know what a participle is? It's an adjective formed from a verb. So there's a verb like differ, and its participle is different. Now, that forming of a participle, that's forming an adjective from a verb, nominalization of an adjective like triangular, forming triangularity. That's different from the participle formation, but still, these are mechanisms the language has to produce a different part of speech from some given part of speech. Being in the vicinity, I cannot resist mentioning a nicety of English grammar that John McDowell had to explain to me, because my policy for different was if the things that were different are nouns, I say this is different from that. This dog is different from that dog. But if they're clauses, if I say, his view is different than I thought it was, because it's clauses that are there, I will use that. And John said, barbarian. Here I'm thinking, look, I've thought about this and I'm using this precisely on the thing. Why barbarian? Because different is a participle. And that means it inherits its pronouns from the verb. So you don't say different than unless you can say differ than. And you don't want to say that, do you, barbarian? Now, both of us remain steadfast in our contempt for the recent Britishism, different to, which you will see. We both agree this is right out. But John's reason for only using different with from is that you can only use from with differ. Now this is a principle in Latin grammar, but people who really think about the English have principles like this. I mean, this was more than I knew, and I did know what a participle was. I just had not sort of had this principle. Okay, so we're going to talk a lot about nominalizations, actually, because I think one of the lessons we can learn from Sellars is that what you want to say about the existence of properties, eventually propositions, about the traditional problem of universals turns on what you say about nominalization. I think this is a lesson we can learn. But let me say something more about abstraction before we get that far. What Frege showed, explained to us, was a mechanism for introducing new terms into the language. You can introduce them based on some terms that are already in the language by abstraction. Take the ones that are already in the language, look at some already statable equivalence relation on them, and then use that to introduce the new term. You say, line A is parallel to line B. And now we have if and only if the direction of A is identical to, equals the direction of B. And that now tells us how to identify and individuate directions, this new kind of thing, based on what we could already do in the old language. That's a method of introducing new terms. What makes you think there's a kind of thing that is introduced such that expressions referring to it are introduced that way? How do you know that by looking at that way of introducing terms, you're picking out a different kind of object? I mean, if it were the case that some things could only be referred to by terms that were introduced in this way, then you could say, oh, by the kind of thing, I mean the kind of thing that you can only refer to with terms that are introduced by abstraction. Now, maybe there are things like that, but from the mere fact that you can introduce a term by abstraction, it doesn't follow, does it, that is in principle the only way you could refer to that kind of thing, to things of that kind. Maybe this is one mode of access to things which we can have other modes of access to. After all, I can say things like, well, I could see that the directions of travel were different. mean, as I can perceive directions of motion. I could perceive that the cheetah and the gazelle were moving in different directions because their paths were not parallel. They were going to intersect. That's something I could see. Maybe there could be another route to directions besides introducing them by abstraction. At least in order to use the term abstract object, you've got to have something to say about what the relationship is between a kind of thing, an ontological matter, and this method of introducing new terms into the language. That's a methodological matter. Right? Remember Sellars diagnosing this mistake that the instrumentalists made, that they were mistaking a methodological difference. Was our mode of access to things exclusively inferential, or did we also have non-inferential access to it? Because lots of things we had both kinds of access to, and the things that we, as a matter of fact, only had inferential access to, that boundary could change over time as we got, learned to observe new things, built instruments, and so on. So what he's saying there is, don't mistake this methodological or epistemological distinction. How do you find out about the things? By inference or also by observation. But don't mistake that for an ontological difference and think that theoretical objects are a kind of thing. They are only in the sort of Pickwickian sense in which, well, we can pick out kinds of things by their relation to us, but as it were, that doesn't have anything, needn't have anything to do with them. In the example, Pluto was introduced, postulated to explain perturbations in the orbit of Neptune. It was a long time before we could observe it. It didn't change when it changed from a theoretical object to an observable one. We can have access to some objects by introducing terms referring to them by abstraction. But that's a methodological thing. That's how we get to talk about them. It's a jump from that to say, and there's a kind of thing that we get access to that way, because, well, I'm suggesting the sort of thing you would need to entitle yourself to say is because that's the only way that you can entitle yourself to talk about these things, is via a process of abstraction. Now, Frege himself agonized about this. And in the literature, sort of reading Frege, this has come to be called the Julius Caesar problem. Because he realizes that although his method of introducing directions, and so numbers and other abstracta, will tell you when two directions are identical or different, it doesn't tell you whether Julius Caesar is identical with the direction of any line. And he's worried, is there any way to settle the truth of those identities? Identities not between directions and directions, between directions and any other kind of thing. Even things introduced by abstraction but from somewhere else. Well, of course, in mathematics, we do that all the time. But maybe that doesn't work for sort of physical objects. Or can physical objects be abstract objects? So it's a live question, sort of what Frege thought about this and where he left the question. I argue that everything turns on a disastrous mistake that he made in footnote 10 to Axiom 5 in the Grundgesetze. But not everyone is convinced by that. Anyway, there's real issues here. So we had the distinguished Frege scholar Joan Weiner as a visitor at Pitt many years ago now, and I attended her Frege seminar, and I gave her such a hard time about using the expression abstract object on this basis, which Frege never uses. He talks about introducing terms by abstraction, that she finally said, look, I'm sick of this. I'm never going to use the phrase again in this seminar room. Whenever I want to say abstract object, I'm going to say banana. And for the rest of the term, we talked about bananas. So I don't insist that you do that, but I recommend it as an exercise to at least consider it when you're tempted to use one of these terms. Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to say those things. Okay. So Sellars has one overarching idea. Terms introduced by abstraction are metalinguistic. The relation between two different vocabularies, the vocabulary of the terms introduced by abstraction and the vocabulary of the more concrete relative to that introduction method vocabulary. So maybe you start off with ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary and find an equivalence relation in it. We talk about things as triangular or as red, adjectives, and we use relations of same shape as, geometrical congruence, or same color as, to introduce these new things, redness and triangularity, as abstract terms by nominalizing those adjectives, nominalizing those predicates, those relational predicates, those adjectives or predicates, and we know exactly how to do that nominalization. Abstraction is a particular kind of nominalization. What it's nominalizing is nouns, but you're introducing new nouns on the basis of old nouns. And Sellars thought, following Carnap, is that's a broadly metalinguistic operation. So he's aiming at a kind of deflation of the semantic pretensions of the terms you introduce that way, saying, look, don't be a global descriptivist or representationalist. Don't assume that the job of these things is to pick out, represent, or describe features of the world. They're playing a metalinguistic role. They're, in some sense, about talking, not about the world. Now, are these mutually exclusive? We will say at the end of the day, but that's the project that he's got. And there's two big hurdles to this that he identified already for the modal vocabulary, and that is, one of them we've already seen, and that is that they're not metalinguistic in the Tarski-Carnap sense. They don't include expressions that refer to linguistic expressions, for instance. And that fact shows up in the dual way that we did see for modality. When we look at translations of them, They translate funny. And when we look at counterfactuals involving differences of language, or there not ever having been any speakers, statements about triangularity don't, we say, well, triangularity is different from circularity, and it would have been even if there had never been anybody to talk about it. But if it's metalinguistic in the Tarski-Carnap sense, then if there had never been the language that you're talking about, these metalinguistic statements wouldn't be true either. So we can't understand their meaning as metalinguistic in that sense. So in what sense is it? Now, think about this as an intellectual task. There's something right about this idea that terms introduced by abstraction have a metalinguistic dimension to them. You started off with the use of the base language, the one in which you can talk about lines and parallel, and on that basis, you've introduced these new expressions. Now, metalinguistic, it may not be talking about them. That may not be the right model for it. But that the use of that base vocabulary is critical to the use of the newly introduced vocabulary in a way in which there is nothing that stands like that to terms like red and triangular, to the OED vocabulary. There isn't some other vocabulary that you introduced this on the basis of. So if by metalinguistic you mean, for instance, to understand the use of direction, you have to understand the use of this other vocabulary of line and parallel talk. If you've got a broad enough sense of metalinguistic to include that, then there's something right. He's picking out that abstraction is a way of moving from one vocabulary to another. That's the metalinguistic. Now, can we articulate what we should say semantically and ontologically from this account of abstraction as elaborating your ability to use the terms line and parallel into your ability to use the expressions same direction and different direction. That's a pragmatic dependence of capacity to use the one vocabulary on the capacity to use the other. Now are we going to be able to get semantic and ultimately ontological conclusions from that? That's the challenge that he's set. And I want to say, whatever you think about the nominalist project that this is in aid of, that's a really important intellectual task, sorting that out. What conclusions can we draw semantically and ontologically from this pragmatic dependence, which our understanding of the process of abstracting, introducing abstract terms like direction on the basis of the use of more concrete terms. And this is going to come up all over philosophy, not just thinking about mathematics or scientific terms. And this is not a solved problem. Nobody knows the answer to this. The answer. Nobody has a really adequate way of vocabulary in which to sort this out. This is still an open question. The second, so that's one challenge, is to say in what sense this is metalinguistic, to sort the issues out between this pragmatic metavocabularies in which we can describe the use of the base language and the use of the abstractive language in the face of these translation problems and the counterfactual problems that say it's not the Tarski-Carnap sense of meta-language. Second thing is a danger not just for Sellars' nominalism, but really for anybody's. The Occam's nominalism back in the Middle Ages was saying, look, I mean, obviously what I'm going to say is extremely crude, and I don't actually know anything about Occam, but the line he's taking is there's no such thing as triangularity in the world. There isn't even a real similarity of triangles in the world. What's similar is the ideas you have of them. And you know, when you talk about these sharing their shape, because they're both triangular, you're saying something about how you're thinking about them, not something about them. It's the way you're responding to them. And one of the troubles with this is it's a sort of half-hearted nominalism. If what you want to say is, well, there's really no universals, but what you're really doing is trading worldly universals for mental ones. You're saying the similarities all in your mind. Yes, but I thought there weren't any similarities. No, there aren't any objective similarities. There's only subjective ones. And the worry about a metalinguistic nominalism is that you're going to trade worldly universals for linguistic universals. That you're going to say, well, sure, you're using the same words for these things, but that's all it is. It's the same names that you're using, and that isn't reflecting, describing, representing anything, any real similarity in the world. Well, but what about the similarity in the language that is the source of this? I don't know, again, this sort of issue comes up again and again in philosophy in the oddest places. The great interpreter of Spinoza in Britain at the end of the 19th century, H.H. Joachim, was also in propria persona an absolute idealist, and so his view was there was a sort of block universe, the absolute, and there weren't really any finite things. There was just this infinite absolute. We say, well, it certainly seems like, you know, there's ladders and trees and stuff, these finite things. And he says, yes, that's just because our poor finite minds can't take in the whole infinite multiplicity, the infinite variety that's there. It's a product. You're filtering all this through, and you're making all these distinctions, cutting it up into these finite things. Why? Because you aren't the absolute mind. You're just this finite little mind. And people said, so there really are these finite little minds, right? Well, no, not really. That too is just an illusion to, well, other finite mind. There was a certain instability in this view. If you're really trying to sort of get away from all the finitude, well, if you're trying to get away from all the universals, the second worry is that you're just trading objective universals for subjective ones. And Sellars systematically addresses these issues by introducing three fabulous bits of technical conceptual machinery. He introduces the notion of distributive singular terms. He introduces the notion of dot quotes, and he introduces the language jumblese. Now, I'm not going to talk about jumblese today. Next week, I want to focus on, next week, on the naming and saying essay, which is where Jumblies is really front and center. It comes up in the abstract entities piece too. But these are bits of conceptual machinery that Sellars will use for the rest of his life and are fabulously helpful for anybody to use. But this is their home language game. They were introduced to do the work of sorting out the sense in which terms introduced by abstraction are metalinguistic. That's the way I want to put it. And I think he makes tremendous progress in doing that. So I'm trying to get better about having these breaks. Why don't we take our 15 minutes now and come back at 2:40, and I'll begin to deploy some of this apparatus.